I stood in the middle of that airport and watched the car pull away. And I kept thinking they're going to come back. They made a mistake. They forgot something. They'll turn around any second now and pull back up to the curb and the door will open and my son will look at me the way he used to look at me when he was small and say, "Mama, I'm sorry, come on, let's go home." But the car didn't come back. I stood there with one small bag at my feet and nothing in my pockets. No phone. No wallet. No ticket. No way home. 71 years old in an airport I had never been to before, in a city I barely knew, and the only person in this world I had trusted completely with my safety had just driven away and left me there. That is where this story begins. But I promise you it does not end there. My name is Dorothy. I'm from a small town outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And I want to tell you something that happened to me that I am no longer ashamed of, because I have learned through fire and through grace, that shame belongs to the people who do the leaving, not to the ones left standing on the curb. I want to tell you this story because I believe you need to hear it. Not for the shock of it. Not because suffering is entertainment. But because I know there are people listening to this right now who have been left somewhere too. Maybe not a physical airport. Maybe the place you were left was a marriage that ended without warning. Maybe it was a friendship you thought was unbreakable. Maybe it was a family that was supposed to be safe and turned out not to be. Maybe you were left in a different way, quietly, gradually, through 1,000 small dismissals, until one day you looked around and realized that the people you had given everything to had simply stopped showing up. If any piece of that is your story too, this is for you. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not just to that airport but further back. Because that day didn't happen in isolation. That day was the final visible result of something that had been building for years. And to understand what I survived, you need to understand what I endured long before I ever stepped foot in that terminal. My son Robert was my only child. I raised him alone after his father left when Robert was 4 years old. I worked 2 jobs for the better part of a decade. I kept the lights on. I kept food on the table. I kept his world as normal and as stable as I possibly could, even when mine was anything but. I did not have a support system. I did not have family nearby. I did not have savings or safety nets or people to call at midnight when the fear got loud. What I had was a little boy who needed me, and that was enough. That was everything. I poured my whole life into raising that boy right. Not perfectly. I was not a perfect mother. No such thing exists. But I was a present one. I was an honest one. I was a mother who showed up, who sacrificed, who chose her child over her own comfort 1,000 times without keeping score. Because that is what love does. It doesn't keep score. It just gives. And for a long time I believed Robert understood that. He grew up, finished school, got a good job. He met a woman named Cheryl and they married. And in the beginning things seemed fine. I was happy for him. I was genuinely, wholeheartedly happy for my son. But slowly, so slowly that I kept finding reasons to explain it away, things began to change. Cheryl had a particular way of operating that I spent too many years being too gracious to name directly. But I'll name it now, not out of bitterness, but because calling a thing what it is can be the most healing act available to us. She was a woman who needed to be the center of everything. Every gathering, every decision, every relationship that Robert had, it needed to orbit around her. And anyone who didn't orbit the way she wanted was slowly, methodically, quietly moved to the outside. I watched it happen to his college friends. I watched it happen to his cousin Marcus, who Robert had been close to since childhood. And then, year by year, visit by visit, phone call by unanswered phone call, I watched it begin to happen to me. I told myself I was imagining it. You know how we do that, how we gaslight ourselves to protect the people we love from being seen clearly. I told myself Cheryl was just private, that she was just protective of their family unit, that I was being oversensitive, that if I was just a little more accommodating, a little less present, a little more careful with my words and my timing and my requests, things would smooth out. So I made myself smaller. I called less. I visited only when invited, and I accepted every cancellation with a smile that I had to manufacture. I bought birthday gifts that went unacknowledged. I sent Christmas cards that were never mentioned. I sat quietly in rooms where I once would have been at the head of the table, because making Cheryl comfortable felt more urgent than preserving my own dignity. And through all of it, my son said nothing. That is the part that still lives in the deepest part of my chest when I sit quietly at night. Not Cheryl's behavior. I can make sense of that, in the way you make sense of a storm. Storms are what they are. But Robert. My Robert, who I held in the hospital, who I walked through every fear and every first and every hard thing alongside. Robert, who knew exactly what I had given. Robert, who saw what was happening and chose again and again to stay silent. The silence of someone you raised is a different kind of wound than anything a stranger can inflict. But I want to come back to that. Because first, I need to take you to that airport. Robert and Cheryl had invited me on a trip. They were visiting Cheryl's family in another state, and they suggested I come along for the first leg. I would stay with them for a few days, they said, and then they'd drop me at the airport for my flight home. It felt like an olive branch. Felt like things might be shifting. It felt, and I am not embarrassed to admit this because hope is one of the most human things we have. It felt like maybe my son was reaching back toward me. I packed a small bag. I told my neighbor I'd be back in 5 days. I got in their car and I believed in my family for one more time. That I won't detail everything that happened during those days, except to say that I felt, with a clarity I couldn't ignore, that I was not a guest. I was something closer to an inconvenience that Robert was attempting to manage, and that Cheryl was barely tolerating. There were small moments, sharp looks, clipped responses, conversations I was talked over, evenings I went to bed early because the atmosphere in the house made staying in the room too heavy to bear. But I told myself, 5 days. I can do 5 days. And then I go home. On the day of my departure, we left early. Robert drove. Cheryl sat in the passenger seat and looked at her phone the entire time. I sat in the back with my bag on my lap, watching the highway, thinking about my own kitchen and my own quiet house and how good it was going to feel to be somewhere I was wanted. We pulled up to the departure's curb. Robert put the car in park. I waited for him to help with my bag, the way I had always seen sons help their mothers. Instead, he turned around and there was something in his face, a tightness and avoidance, that made my stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. "Mama," he said, "we need to tell you something." He told me that my flight had been canceled, that they hadn't had time to rebook it, that they had to get back on the road, that there was a customer service desk inside and they'd figure it out for me. He handed me nothing. Not a card. Not a phone. Not the name of anyone to call. He said, "You'll be okay," in the tone of someone who is not actually certain but needs to leave anyway. And the door closed. And the car pulled forward. And I stood on that curb and I watched my son disappear into traffic. Let me tell you what happens to a person in the immediate moments after something like that. Your brain does not accept it. There is a processing delay that is actually a mercy, a few seconds where the full weight of what has just occurred hasn't landed yet, because if it landed all at once it would be unbearable. So you stand there and you think practical thoughts. You think, okay, there's a customer service desk. I'll go inside. I'll sort this out. I'll call someone. And then the next thought, call someone with what? My phone is in my bag. My bag, where is my bag? Here. Okay. But my phone needs charging and I have no charger. And the customer service desk, yes, but what do I do about money? My purse has $8 and a grocery store loyalty card. $8. I was 71 years old in a strange city in a busy airport with $8 and a dead phone and a son who had just driven away from me. I want to be very honest with you about what I felt standing there. Because the instinct when you tell a story like this is to skip to the strength. To jump to the part where the resolve kicks in and the chin lifts and the woman decides she is not going to be defeated. And that part is coming. I promise you that part is real and it is coming. But first, I felt something else entirely. I felt small. Not the way a child feels small, which can be a kind of safety. The other kind of small. The kind that comes when someone who was supposed to protect you has made you feel as though you do not matter. The kind that makes you look around at the crowded, rushing world and feel completely invisible. I felt the particular humiliation of being an elderly woman standing alone with a small bag and nowhere to go. And I felt, for a few terrible minutes, the thing that I imagine they wanted me to feel, even if they never consciously admitted to wanting it. I felt like a burden. Like a problem that had been deposited somewhere inconvenient by people who had run out of patience for dealing with it. I want to stop and speak directly to anyone who has ever been made to feel that way. By a family member. By a partner. By anyone who was supposed to be safe. You are not a burden. You were never a burden. You were a person who loved people who were not equipped to honor what you gave them. And that is a failure of their character, not a verdict on your worth. But I didn't know how to feel that yet. In those first minutes on that curb, I only knew the smallness. What I did next was the first act of a woman who was beginning, without knowing it, to fight back. I picked up my bag. I squared my shoulders. And I walked inside. I found the customer service desk. The line was long. I stood in it for 40 minutes. When I finally reached the front, a young woman behind the counter, her name tag said Alyssa, looked at me with the careful neutrality of someone trained to manage difficult situations. I told her my name. I told her my flight had been canceled. I told her I had no way to contact anyone for help and very little money. And then, to my profound surprise and embarrassment, I started to cry, not a dignified, composed cry. The real kind. The kind that comes from deeper than the immediate situation, from all the layers underneath, the years of making myself smaller, the visit that had confirmed what I already knew but hadn't wanted to know, and the raw animal fear of being completely alone in a strange place with no resources. Alyssa didn't look away. She didn't summon a manager. She didn't treat me like a problem to be managed. She looked at me, the way people look at you when they are actually seeing you, and she said quietly and clearly, "Ma'am, I've got you. Don't worry. We're going to figure this out together." I want you to hold that sentence. Because in the course of a very hard day, those 10 words did something to me that I am not sure I can fully describe. They reminded me that strangers can sometimes offer what family has failed to give. They reminded me that the world contains more kindness than cruelty, more decency than indifference, more people willing to stand in the gap than we remember when fear is loudest. Alyssa spent 45 minutes working on my situation. She found me a rebooked flight. Not until the following morning. She flagged something in her system that I don't fully understand, but that allowed me to get a voucher for a room at an airport hotel for the night. She sat with me while I used the desk phone to call my neighbor back in Tennessee, who nearly fell out of her chair with worry and immediately called her daughter, who had a credit card, who read the number over the phone so I could get a meal. One stranger. One young woman with a name tag and steady eyes. She held the entire thing together for me when I couldn't hold it myself. I ate alone at an airport restaurant that night. I ordered something simple and I ate slowly, and I looked out the window at the plane sitting on the tarmac, and I thought about my life. Not in a dramatic way. In the way that you think about your life when you have been stripped of every comfortable illusion and you are left with only what is actually true. This is what was true. I had given my life, genuinely, sacrificially, without reservation, to a son who had, on this day, chosen his wife's convenience over his mother's safety. That was true. I could not make it untrue. I could not explain it away any further. I had spent years manufacturing explanations, building defenses on his behalf, editing the evidence to preserve a version of my son that matched the boy I had raised. And sitting alone in that airport restaurant, that capacity for self-deception simply ran out. Robert had left me at an airport with no money. And it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. That is the sentence I had been running from for years. That is the sentence I had wrapped in 100 layers of excuse and loyalty, and a mother's bottomless capacity to believe the best about her child. But sitting in that plastic airport chair, with a plate of food I hadn't really tasted and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, I finally let it land. Every dismissal had been a choice. Every unanswered call had been a choice. Every cancelled visit, every thinly veiled insult I was expected to absorb gracefully, every moment Robert had watched me be diminished and said nothing, each one had been a deliberate act of choosing someone else over me, choosing comfort over courage, choosing peace with Cheryl over truth with his mother. And this day, this airport, this curb, this $8, was simply the day that choice became impossible to ignore. I sat with that truth for a long time, and I want to be completely honest about what that felt like. Because there is a version of this story where the realization brings immediate clarity and strength, and a warrior rises from the ashes in the airport restaurant. But that is not what happened. What happened was something quieter and, in its own way, more profound. I grieved. Not for the loss of a relationship, because the relationship, I was finally admitting, had not truly existed in the form I needed it to for a very long time. I grieved for the version of it I had been holding on to. I grieved for the son I had raised and the mother I had been, and the enormous, undeniable distance between those two realities and where we had ended up. I grieved for all the years I had spent shrinking myself in hopes that less of me would make things easier for everyone else. That I grieved the way you grieve a death. Slowly, fully, with complete permission. And somewhere in the middle of that grief, In that airport restaurant, alone with the planes outside and the strangers around me and the quiet evidence that the world was going on exactly as it always did, something in me went very still. Not the stillness of defeat. The stillness of a woman who has hit the absolute bottom of a thing and realized, with unexpected calm, that the bottom is solid, that she is standing on it, and that standing on something solid means there is only one direction left to go. Up. I went to the hotel room they had arranged for me and I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at my hands. These hands had changed diapers and braided hair and held a crying child through nightmares and packed school lunches, and worked double shifts and typed letters and planted a garden and made a home out of circumstances that didn't invite it. These hands had been busy quietly every day of my life with the work of building and sustaining and loving. They had not failed me. I had not failed me. I said that out loud. There in that hotel room, to no one but the walls and whatever was listening beyond them, that I have not failed myself. And then I said something else. Something I had not said in years, maybe decades, because somewhere along the way I had learned to make my needs invisible in order to survive inside my own family. I said it quietly, but I said it clearly. I deserve better than this. 3 words. 5 syllables. And the weight that shifted in my chest when I said them out loud was extraordinary. Like a lock turning that I had forgotten was locked. Like a window opening in a room that had been sealed too long. I deserve better than this. I did not sleep much that night. But the wakefulness was different from the kind I had known for years. The anxious, circling wakefulness of someone trying to solve an unsolvable problem. This wakefulness was something closer to watchfulness. I was awake the way a person is awake at the beginning of something. I thought about my life. The real shape of it, stripped of the stories I had told myself. I thought about what I had and what I had sacrificed and what remained. I thought about my house in Tennessee, small, familiar mine. I thought about my neighbor Carol, who had nearly come undone with worry when I called. I thought about the women from my church who had known me for 30 years, whose voices I could hear in my head as clearly as if they were sitting beside me. I thought about my garden, which needed tending. I thought about the sunrise over the ridge behind my house, which I had never once taken for granted. I thought about all the things that were still real and good and mine. And I realized something. The things that were most deeply, unshakably mine had nothing to do with Robert. They predated Robert. They existed independently of his choices and his silence and his absence. My worth, my history, my capacity for love, my knowledge of who I was, none of it had ever actually lived inside my son's opinion of me. I had only been acting as though it did. I had handed the deed to my own dignity to someone who didn't know its value. And the work ahead of me, the real work, the most important work I had ever been assigned, was to take it back. I flew home the next morning. When the plane landed in Nashville and I walked through the terminal and out into the Tennessee air, I stood on the sidewalk outside Arrivals for a long moment and just breathed. The smell of it. The feel of familiar sky. Something in my body recognized home in a way that went deeper than thought. Carol was waiting. She had driven an hour to come get me because that is what real people do. When she saw me come through the doors, she didn't say anything at first. She just put her arms around me and held on. And I let her. I didn't manage it or perform strength or tell her I was fine. I let her hold me, and I was grateful in a way I had not allowed myself to be grateful for ordinary kindness in far too long. On the drive home, she asked me what happened. And I told her. All of it. Not the edited version. Not the version that softened Robert's choices or made Cheryl the sole villain, or found some diplomatic middle ground. The whole, unvarnished truth. Carol listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Dorothy, I've been watching this happen for years and I never said what I should have said. So let me say it now. You are one of the finest women I have ever known. And what your son did is not a reflection of who you are. It is a reflection of who he chose to become." Simple words. But they cracked me open in a completely different way than the grief had. Because that's the other thing about betrayal by family that nobody warns you about. It doesn't just hurt you. It makes you question your own judgment. It makes you ask, what did I do wrong? How did I raise someone capable of this? Is there something in me that invites being treated this way? Am I somehow responsible for being left on that curb? And I want to speak to anyone who is sitting with those questions right now. Because they are seductive questions. They feel like accountability, but they are not. They are self-attack dressed up in the language of reflection. And the answer to every single one of them is the same. No. You did not cause someone else's cruelty. You did not deserve someone else's abandonment. You did not invite mistreatment by being too loving, too available, too trusting, too hopeful. Those are not character flaws. Those are the qualities of a good person who placed trust in someone who was not equal to it. The failure belongs to them, not to your love. In the weeks that followed, I did something I had never given myself real permission to do. I allowed people to help me. Not because I was helpless, but because I was finally honest enough to admit that I was human. And humans are not designed to carry everything alone. We are designed for community, for connection, for the kind of mutual holding that says, your weight is my weight when yours becomes too heavy to carry by yourself. Carol organized a small dinner at her house that first weekend. Just a handful of women from the neighborhood and the church. Women who had known me for decades. Women who had watched my boy grow up, who had brought casseroles when I was sick, who had sat beside me in the pew through decades of Sundays. Women who, when I walked into Carol's kitchen that evening, looked at me with eyes that said, we see you, and we are not going anywhere. I had almost not gone. Old habits are powerful things. The voice that says don't burden people, don't make your pain the centerpiece, don't ask for more than your share of the room. That voice was loud that evening. I stood outside Carol's door for a full minute before I knocked. But I knocked. And walking into that kitchen was one of the most important things I have ever done. Because it proved to me, concretely, physically, undeniably, that I was not as alone as the airport had made me feel. That the story Robert's absence told about my value was not the whole story. Was not even close to the whole story. Miss Evelyn, who was 78 and had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children largely by herself, sat beside me that night and held my hand across the table and said, baby, the people who leave us reveal themselves, not us. She said it like scripture. Like something she had carried a long time and knew to be true, the way you know the words to a song you learned in childhood. And I filed it away in the part of me that was beginning, slowly and unevenly, to rebuild. The people who leave us reveal themselves. Not us. I am going to say that again because I need you to hear it all the way down. The people who leave you reveal themselves. Not you. When someone abandons you, whether it is at an airport or in a marriage or in a friendship or in any form that abandonment takes, they are not pronouncing a verdict on your worth. They are demonstrating the limit of their own capacity. They are showing you, as clearly as anything in this life can be shown, the precise location of the ceiling of what they are able to give. And as devastating as it is to discover that ceiling, as painful as it is to look up and see it right there, right above you, where open sky should have been, the discovery is also a gift. A hard gift. A brutal gift. But a gift. Because now you know. Now you are no longer building your sense of safety on a foundation that was never going to hold. Now you can build on something real. I want to talk about Robert. Because this story would be incomplete if I let anger or hurt speak the last word about my son. And I want to tell you honestly where I landed with him, not to provide a tidy resolution because real life is rarely tidy, but because the way I chose to hold the truth about Robert became one of the most important decisions of my life. About 3 weeks after I came home, Robert called. I almost didn't answer. I sat looking at the phone ringing in my hand and I felt the full complexity of it. The anger, the hurt, the grief, and underneath all of that, the completely irrational and entirely human pull of a mother toward the sound of her child. He was still my son. Whatever he had done, whatever he had become, he was still the boy I had held in the hospital and walked to school and rocked through nightmares. That doesn't disappear. I want to be honest about that. It does not disappear. I answered. He was not calling to apologize. Not genuinely. He offered a version of an explanation, something about how Cheryl had been under a lot of pressure, how the timing had been difficult, how he thought I would be okay, how the airline should have had better systems. An explanation that placed responsibility everywhere except where it actually lived. I let him finish. And then I said something I had been rehearsing in my mind since that hotel room. Not in anger. Not in tears. In the clearest, calmest voice I have used in my adult life. Robert, I said. I love you. I will always love you. You are my child and that is permanent and nothing that has happened changes it. But what you did at that airport was wrong. And I am not going to pretend it wasn't. I am not going to explain it away, and I am not going to shrink from saying it clearly. You left me. With nothing. And that cannot be undone by an explanation. It can only be addressed by a change. There was a long silence, and then he said, Mama, I didn't think it was that big a deal. And there it was. In one sentence, the entire architecture of how we had arrived at that airport curb was made visible. He hadn't thought it was that big a deal. Not because he was evil. Not because he had no capacity for love, but because for years I had made myself so easy to minimize, so practiced at absorbing mistreatment without complaint, so committed to keeping the peace at the cost of my own dignity, that the threshold of what registered to him as a problem had shifted dramatically. I had, without meaning to, taught him that I was endurable, and hearing that sentence, I didn't think it was that big a deal, was the moment I understood that there was work for me to do that had nothing to do with Robert. There was work I needed to do inside myself. Because here is the thing I had to face honestly, and it is perhaps the most difficult part of this entire story to tell. The people who treated me as less than I deserved did not operate in a vacuum. They operated in the space I created. Not intentionally, not consciously, but systematically, over years. I had communicated through my behavior and my silences and my endless accommodations that I was someone who could be set aside without serious consequence. That my needs were negotiable. That my comfort was optional. That my presence was something to be managed rather than treasured. That I am not saying this to blame myself for Robert's choices. I want to be very clear about that. What he did was wrong regardless of any dynamic I contributed to. Adults are responsible for their own actions. Full stop. But if I wanted my life to be different going forward, if I wanted relationships built on genuine mutual respect rather than on my endless willingness to accept less, then I had to look at my own patterns with the same honesty I was applying to his. I had to ask myself the uncomfortable question: where did I learn to make myself this small? And the answer, when I sat quietly enough to hear it, came from a long way back. It came from a childhood in a home where love was conditional on being good and quiet and undemanding, where the needs of a child were secondary to the moods of the adults around her, where the safest thing to be was invisible because visible things got managed and managed was painful. I had learned to disappear long before Robert gave me a reason to. And the healing, the real healing, the deep root kind, had to begin there. Not with Robert. Not with Cheryl. With the small girl who had learned that taking up space was dangerous, and who had carried that lesson into every relationship of her adult life, and who had built a beautiful, loving, self-sacrificing exterior over a foundation of deep, unexamined unworthiness. That is the work I began that year. Quietly, steadily, with the help of a counselor at the community center, a woman about my daughter's age who sat across from me in a small office on Tuesday afternoons and asked me questions nobody had ever thought to ask. Not about Robert. About me. About the girl before Robert. About what I believed I was worth and where I had learned to believe it. That work was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than raising a child alone. Harder than working 2 jobs. Harder than standing on that airport curb. Because all of those things required strength directed outward. This required something different. This required me to turn that strength inward. To stop directing my courage at surviving external circumstances and begin directing it at the internal ones. The old stories. The calcified beliefs. The deeply buried conviction that I was only as valuable as what I produced for other people. Dismantling those things did not happen overnight. It happened the way most real change happens, in small, quiet increments that feel inadequate in the moment and look transformative only when you measure the distance from where you started. But it happened. And I want to tell you about some of the specific things that changed. Not in abstract terms. In real, practical, daily life terms. I started saying no. Not dramatically. Not as a declaration of war on anyone. Just no. When something didn't serve me, when an invitation felt like an obligation wearing a dress, when a relationship asked more than it gave, I started saying the word. Quietly. Firmly. Without the paragraph of justification I had always felt was required. Just no. And the extraordinary thing about that was how the world did not end when I said it. The people who truly valued me accepted it. Some people didn't like it and they drifted. And I let them go and noticed that their going made more room than their staying ever had. I started taking up space. I rearranged my house. That might sound trivial, but stay with me. For years, I had lived inside my own home as though I was a guest who didn't want to leave a mark. There were whole rooms I barely used. A sewing table buried under other people's things. A back porch I had not sat on in the evening for longer than I could remember, because evenings had somehow become another thing to manage rather than enjoy. I cleared the sewing table. I sat on the porch. I watched the evening come in over the ridge and I let it be beautiful without feeling guilty for having a moment that was only mine. These are small things. I know they are small things. But the accumulation of small things done differently is how a life changes direction. The grand gesture is a myth. The real revolution happens in the Tuesday afternoons and the rearranged furniture and the single word no said firmly to the thing that had always counted on you to say yes. I also started letting people love me. This was perhaps the most radical change of all, because I had spent so long in the role of the giver, the one who shows up, who provides, who holds things together, that being on the receiving end of care felt deeply uncomfortable. Almost wrong. As though by accepting help or affection or attention I was doing something indulgent, taking something that wasn't mine to take. And I had to learn, one encounter at a time, that receiving love gracefully is not weakness. It is one of the most sophisticated forms of strength. It requires you to believe at a cellular level that you are worth giving to. And for someone who has spent a lifetime operating from a different belief, it is genuinely difficult work. Carol's daughter brought me soup one evening when I had a cold. And instead of saying, "Oh, you didn't have to do that, I'm fine, you should go take care of your own," I said thank you. I let her come in. We sat at my kitchen table for an hour and talked about nothing in particular, and it was one of the warmest evenings I had spent in years. Because I let it happen. Because I got out of its way. My church community showed up for me in ways that made me understand the word grace in a new way. Not the grace of being forgiven. The grace of being held. The grace of being seen consistently, week after week, by people who didn't need you to be performing anything. Who simply knew you, showed up for you. And let that be enough. I want to say something to anyone listening who has been pulling away from community, from church, from neighbors, from old friends, because the pain of family has made all closeness feel dangerous. I understand that impulse completely. When the people who were supposed to be safest turn out to be the source of the wound, it is natural to want to put walls between yourself and all human contact. To decide that keeping people at a distance is how you keep yourself from being hurt again. But isolation is not protection. Isolation is just a different kind of pain. One that you are both experiencing and administering to yourself simultaneously. The answer to being hurt by closeness is not the abolition of closeness. It is the discernment of where to place it. It is learning the difference between the people who have proven themselves worthy of your openness and the ones who have demonstrated they are not. You don't close the door. You become more careful about who you open it to. Now, I want to talk about Robert. In the year after the airport, Robert and I had several conversations. Some of them were painful. Some of them circled the same territory without resolution. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the boy I had raised. A softness in his voice, a hesitation before he repeated one of Cheryl's positions as though it were his own. And those moments both gave me hope and broke my heart simultaneously. There was no dramatic reconciliation. I want to be honest about that. There was no scene where Robert wept and acknowledged everything and asked for forgiveness, and we embraced and the relationship was made new and whole. That is the version that feels satisfying in a movie. It is not always the version life provides. What there was a slow and imperfect recalibration. A gradual, cautious, sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back rebuilding of something that was never going to look like what it had been. Because what it had been, I finally understood, was not actually what I had believed it to be. I had been in love with a version of the relationship that existed more in my hope than in reality. What we were building now was something more honest. Smaller, more boundaried, less perfect, but built on truth instead of performance. And a small true thing, I have learned, is worth more than a large false one every time. There are people in my life now who call me mama who share none of my blood. Women from the church who are my daughters in every sense that matters to daily life. Neighbors who check on me, who bring things over, who call when the weather turns rough. A community of people bound together not by biology but by choice, by the daily renewable decision to show up for each other. Family is not always the people you were born to. Sometimes family is the people life delivers to you through entirely different doors. And sometimes the family that finds you on the other side of your deepest loss is more real, more sustaining, and more yours than anything that came before it. I want to talk about forgiveness. Because I know it is the question underneath everything else when a story like this gets told. Did you forgive your son? Do you forgive Cheryl? How do you forgive something like that? Here is what I have come to understand about forgiveness, and I say it not as a preacher from a pulpit but as a woman who has wrestled with it privately and arrived somewhere honest. Forgiveness is not a gift you give to the person who hurt you. It is a gift you give to yourself. It is the decision, deliberate, ongoing, sometimes requiring renewal every single morning, to stop allowing someone else's choices to live in your body as poison. It is the refusal to let what was done to you on one specific day in one specific airport define the entire remainder of your story. It is the recognition that carrying bitterness is an exhausting, consuming, expensive business, and that you have better uses for your energy. Forgiveness does not mean what happened was acceptable. It was not acceptable. Forgiveness does not mean the relationship is restored to what it was. It may not be. Forgiveness does not even mean the person who hurt you knows you have forgiven them or deserves to. This forgiveness is entirely for you. It lives entirely in you. It requires nothing from them and changes nothing about the factual record of what occurred. It simply releases you from the obligation to keep carrying it as a wound, and I will tell you this. The day I genuinely, fully, with my whole heart decided to forgive Robert and Cheryl, not perform forgiveness, not announce forgiveness, not use the word forgiveness while still nourishing the anger underneath, the day I truly released it, I felt physically lighter. I am not speaking metaphorically. I felt lighter in my body, like something that had been gripped tight in my chest for a long, long time finally opened its fist and let go. That lightness is available to you too. Whatever you are carrying, whoever left you somewhere, it is available, but you have to choose it. And it may take longer than you expect and require more honesty than is comfortable, and demand that you visit it again when it sneaks back in because it does sneak back in. Forgiveness is rarely a single decision. It is often a practice. But it is a practice worth undertaking with everything you have. Because on the other side of it is something extraordinary. And that something is freedom. I am 73 years old now. 2 years since that airport. And I want to tell you about my life today. Not to show off. Not to perform a recovery. But because I think people need to hear what is genuinely possible on the other side of the hardest seasons. My garden has never been more beautiful. I know that is a simple thing to say. But that garden is not a metaphor. It is a real garden, real soil, real blooms, real work with these hands every morning when the light comes up over the ridge. And it feeds me in a way I had forgotten gardens could feed a person. It connects me to something older than my pain and larger than my circumstances. It reminds me that growth is the natural direction of living things. That you can cut a plant back severely and it will still, given sun and water and time, find its way toward the light. I started a small group at the church for women who have experienced family estrangement. It meets on the second and fourth Saturday of every month, around a folding table with coffee and no judgment. Women of every age. Women who have been cut off by adult children, abandoned by spouses, dismissed by siblings, left out of families they gave everything to build. Women who carry the particular shame of that specific wound, the one that says if your own family doesn't want you, what does that say about you? I sit at that table and I say first thing every time it says nothing about you. It says everything about them. And then we get to work. Those Saturdays are some of the most meaningful hours of my life. I am not a counselor. I have no credential except my own survived story. But a survived story offered honestly and without pretense is sometimes the most therapeutic thing in a room. Because it says I was there. Where you are right now I was there. And look at me still standing. Look at me making coffee and tending my garden and sitting at this table choosing every day to be here fully and without apology. Look at what survived. I want to say something now specifically to anyone who is older. Anyone who is listening to this and thinking, that's a beautiful idea, healing and rebuilding and new beginnings, but I'm too old for that now. The window has passed. At my age you don't start over. You just endure what's left. I want to challenge that belief with every cell in my body. I was 71 years old on that airport curb. 71. And the 2 years since have been among the most alive, most honest, most purposeful years of my life. Not the easiest. Not the most comfortable. But the most real. The most me. The years in which the person I always was, underneath all the accommodating, all the shrinking, all the self-erasure, finally got to come out and live in the open air. Age is not an expiration date on becoming. There is no age at which the invitation to grow, to change, to choose differently, to live more fully expires. That invitation remains open until the last day. And the life you have accumulated, the decades of experience, of wisdom earned in the hardest classrooms, of knowing precisely what matters because you have watched what doesn't, that is not a liability at 71. That is an extraordinary asset. You know things that younger people are still in the process of learning. You have a relationship with what is truly important that only time and loss and living can build. You have survived things that would stop a younger heart. You have, if you let yourself access it, A depth and a groundedness and a clarity that is among the most valuable things a human being can possess. Oh, not let anyone, including the voice inside your own head, tell you that your best days are behind you. Your most honest days may be directly in front of you. Your most purposeful chapter may be the one you're about to begin. Begin it. Let me tell you the last thing. The thing I say for the end of every Saturday meeting, and the thing I want to leave with you today. There is a woman I need you to meet. You've known her your whole life. She has been with you through every single thing you've ever survived. She was there at the beginning of every hard season, and she was there at the end of every one. She showed up on the days when showing up took more courage than most people know. She kept going when stopping would have been far easier. She loved fully and gave generously, and yes, she made mistakes, real ones, honest ones, human ones, but she never stopped trying to be good. She never stopped trying to build something worth having. She was there on every hard morning. She was there in every room you ever had to walk into alone. She was there at the airport when the car drove away and she picked up her bag and she squared her shoulders and she walked inside. That woman is you. And she has earned through every single thing she has carried the right to be treated by the world, by the people in her life, and most critically by herself with complete and unwavering dignity. You are not what was done to you. You are not the person who left you. You are not the sum of the ways you were overlooked, undervalued, minimized, or abandoned. You are not the airport. You are not the empty wallet. You are not the silence on the other end of the phone. You are the woman who walked inside. And walking inside, choosing to keep going, choosing to seek help, choosing to stand in a line for 40 minutes with dignity intact even when dignity felt impossible, that is the act of someone who is not finished. Not by a long way. Your story is not a tragedy because it contains tragedy. Life contains tragedy. All the stories worth telling do. Your story is what it is, complex and painful and honest and marked by love and loss and betrayal and unexpected grace. And none of those chapters have closed the book. The book is still open. The next page is blank. And the only question that matters now is not what was written on the pages behind you. It is what you are going to write on this one. Write something true. Write something brave. Write something that looks like the fullest possible version of the woman who has been waiting patiently and stubbornly underneath everything that tried to bury her. Write a life that says, I was left at an airport and I found my way home, and home turned out to be something bigger and better and more genuinely mine than anything I left behind. Write a life that says, I was not finished. I was just beginning. Because you are, Dorothy says, you are just beginning. And so am I. And so are we all.